Now that the compositing work is done in this image, it's time to address some of the just overall tonal, brightness, and color issues. So the first thing I want to do is I want to darken this down quite a bit. I want to create a much more kind of moody and mysterious image. And I'm going to start with the overall look of the background. So I'm going to click on the layer immediately below the man, the layer called Rock Step. And I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. So I'll come down to the layers panel, click the add adjustment layer button, and I'm just going to darken this down a bit. Pull down on the curve that way. And maybe I'll pull up a little bit on this kind of highlight part of the curve here so the highlights don't get too dark. I think that creates a nice change there. Now, if some of this is getting a little bit too dark for your taste, remember you can always just target the layer mask, get your brush tool, and paint with black, maybe at 50% opacity or something, to kind of dilute the strength of that darkening there. So I do like the effect that it's having darkening most of the water in the ocean, but it is nice to maybe hold that back a little bit on some of these rocks. We'll just kind of come in here and dab those a little bit. Just preserve some of that detail there. And we'll do this one too as well. Okay. And I'll just rename that layer Darken Seascape. Next, I'm going to make the man layer active, and I'm going to add a grouped adjustment layer that only affects his layer to slightly darken down him. So I'm going to hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows, and I'll click the Add Adjustment Layer button. I'll choose Curves, and I'll use this option here to use the previous layer to create a clipping mask. And by the way, if you forget to hold down that keyboard shortcut while you're adding the adjustment layer, you can always click on this button here in the Properties panel, and that will also group the layer to the one immediately beneath it. So let me just zoom up closer here so I can see the man a bit better. So I'm just darkening this down to kind of make this fit with the overall darker feeling I'm giving the image. And I am going to set the blend mode for this curves layer to luminosity, just because I saw a slight kind of change in the color on his head there, and that just prevents that from happening. So the luminosity blend mode will make it so that the adjustment layer only affects the brightness values in the image and not the color values. I'm going to paint on this layer mask a little bit. I've got black as my foreground color, maybe 50 or 40%. I'm just going to paint a little bit on the back of the jacket so it's not getting quite so dark. And here on the back of the jeans. All right, that's good. I'm going to leave the darkness affecting the lower part of his jeans just to kind of suggest that maybe they've gotten wet from, the waves breaking over the rock there. All right, so now I'm going to come up and click on the top layer group, the one called Rock Covering Foot, and I'm going to add a new layer group just by coming and clicking on the new group icon here. I'm going to double click on the name of that, and I'll just call this Tonal Styling. The first thing I'm going to do with this layer group open is I'm going to add a black and white layer. And I'm going to increase the brightness of the reds a little bit and bring the blues down. That'll make the water a little bit darker. And by increasing the reds and the yellow, it keeps the skin tones from getting too dark. Next, I'm going to add a hue saturation layer. I'm going to click the Colorize button, and I'm going to enter a hue value of about 38, which creates a nice sepia tone. I'm going to lower the saturation on that down to about 12 or something like that. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint on the layer mask for this layer. I'm going to paint with black, and I'm just going to paint over the water. And I'm going to do this kind of, very loose here. If it's not total even coverage, that's okay. I can always fix that later. And it's actually just sort of kind of a loose style here. So what this is doing, I'm not actually adding blue. I'm just basically removing that kind of warm brownish sepia color and revealing the gray. And the contrast with the sepia is just sort of making it look blue. And we're going to diminish this here in a bit anyway. So we'll just kind of paint over there. That's good enough for now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the layer mask for that hue saturation layer, and I'll go up to the properties panel for that mask, and I can change the density of the black. So right now the blacks are black in the mask, but if I lower this down, you can see in the mask they're becoming more gray. So gray means, don't block it out as much as before. So it is letting more of the sepia show through. So I can kind of modulate the look of that. So something around 75% looks okay. And finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another curves adjustment layer. And my aim here is to kind of darken the top part of the sky. So I will be adding a gradient mask to modify this after I make the basic adjustment. I'm just going to pull this down like this. Something like that looks pretty good. And now I'll get my gradient tool. Make sure I'm using a black to white gradient. And the mode is set to normal, and the style is set to this first style here, which is linear gradient. And I'm going to drag up from, middle of the sky, I guess, or maybe just about where the man's head is, and drag up. And you can see that that is now darkening only the top part of the sky. Make some final adjustments here. I'll go down to the darken seascape curves layer and kind of just pull that down a little bit more. Again, going for kind of a moody look here. And then come back up to the grouped curves layer that is affecting the man. Double click there and maybe pull that down a little bit more. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with this. So the main issues with this composite were combining two different photos of the same rocks, but taken from slightly different angles, in order to get the best of both images and preserve the notch in the rocks that I like so much. And by strategically copying sections of rocks from elsewhere in the image, I was able to modify the rock under the man to make it much more believable that he was actually standing there. Finally, the multiple adjustment layers create a color and tonal styling treatment that ties everything together.